The Velithari had a saying, "If it does not shine, it does not matter." It was not a military saying. It was not a political one either. It was older than both. It came from the earliest days of the empire, back when the first Velithari kings decided that power should be visible, that strength should announce itself before it entered the room, that a warrior worth fearing would never allow herself to look like she had actually been in a fight. It was, in the opinion of most Velithari historians, a perfectly reasonable philosophy. It was also, as General Halvek would later write in his private journal, the exact reason they almost made the worst mistake in the history of the empire. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The human delegation arrived on a gray morning. The sky above the Velithari capital city of Oveth was doing what it always did in the cold season, which was threatening rain without actually committing to it. The landing platform on the roof of the Royal Diplomatic Receiving Hall was polished white stone, trimmed with silver. The honor guards standing along both sides of the platform wore ceremonial armor that had never seen a battlefield. It was magnificent. Every surface caught the light. Every buckle was aligned. Every soldier stood at exactly the same angle with the same expression, which was a careful mixture of pride and total blankness. Princess Sovea stood at the far end of the platform. She was, by any measure, impressive. Tall, even for a Velithari. Her formal coat was deep violet with silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar. Her crown was not the heavy ceremonial one she wore for public processions. It was the smaller, sharper one, the one her advisors called the working crown, which meant she was here in an official military diplomatic capacity and not simply performing for a crowd. She had her hands clasped behind her back. She had her chin at exactly the right angle. She had rehearsed this posture since she was 7 years old, and it showed. Beside her stood General Halvek, the commander of the Velithari Northern Fleet. He was broad for a Velithari, which still made him narrower than most humans, though he would have argued that point aggressively. Beside him stood General Orvina, head of ground operations, and beside her stood Admiral Teska, who commanded the orbital defense platforms and who had, reportedly, never smiled at anything in her professional career. They were all watching the shuttle descend. It was a human shuttle, medium size, diplomatic configuration, which meant it had the extra shielding around the passenger compartment and the extended communications array on the roof. It was gray, matte gray specifically, not polished, not decorated, not gleaming in any way whatsoever. General Orvina made a small sound. "Is that paint?" she said quietly. Halvek looked. There were indeed patches along the left side of the shuttle's hull where the finish had been rubbed away and replaced with something that was clearly functional and clearly not intended to look good. "I believe so," he said. "They repainted their diplomatic shuttle with flat gray paint?" "It appears that way." Orvina considered this. "Why?" Nobody answered her, because the shuttle was landing, and the princess was watching, and this was not the moment for conversation. The landing struts touched down. The engines wound to silence. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, which was exactly the correct diplomatic pause, long enough to build anticipation without being long enough to seem slow. Then the side ramp descended. The first person down the ramp was a young man. He was human, clearly. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, a formal diplomatic suit that was neat and well-fitted and entirely unremarkable. He carried a case. He was the translator. His name was Obi Crane, and he had been assigned to this delegation 6 months ago, and he had spent most of those 6 months quietly hoping that today would go smoothly, which, already, he could sense it would not. He stepped to the left of the ramp and stood at attention. Then Mara Austin came down. Now, let me describe this carefully, because the description matters. Mara Austin was the ranking military representative of the Human Interstellar Defense Command, attached to the diplomatic mission as security lead and formal military liaison. She held the rank of commander. She had held it for 11 years. Before that, she had held lower ranks, and before that, she had been a private, and before that, she had been a teenager on a colony world that no longer existed, for reasons that were directly related to why she had joined the military in the first place. She was not especially tall, not especially broad, not especially anything, by the standards of a species that came in an enormous variety of shapes and sizes. She had a face that was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, which is to say, it gave you very little information about what was happening below the surface. Her armor was old. That was the first thing you noticed. That was, frankly, the only thing you noticed, because it was so startling against the backdrop of the gleaming Velithari honor guard and the polished platform and the silver-trimmed receiving hall. It was not old in the sense of being antique or decorative. It was old in the sense of having been used extensively. The surface was scratched in at least 40 places that were visible from a distance. There were dents along the left shoulder plate and along the right forearm guard. There were 2 long dark scorch marks along the chest, one horizontal, one diagonal, crossing each other in a shape that looked almost deliberate. The joints were worn smooth. The boots were the same, scraped and darkened at the toes. It fit her perfectly. It moved with her the way armor only moves when a person has worn it for a very, very long time. She walked down the ramp, and she looked at the princess. She did not salute. She inclined her head. One single measured movement. Then she straightened and was still. Princess Sovea looked at her for a moment. Then the princess looked at her generals. Then she looked back at Mara. Then she said, loudly enough for the entire honor guard to hear, "I was told humans sent warriors. I did not expect them to send a museum piece." The honor guard did not laugh. They were professionals, and they were on duty. But several of the courtiers standing at the edges of the platform did, politely, briefly, behind raised hands. Obi Crane's jaw tightened by approximately 1 millimeter. Mara Austin said nothing. She simply continued looking at the princess with that quiet, surface of deep water expression, and waited for the formal greeting to proceed. The formal greeting proceeded. The introductions were made. The diplomatic pleasantries were exchanged. Obi translated with perfect neutrality, which was a professional achievement because several of the pleasantries from the Velithari side were not especially pleasant. It was during the reception afterward, while the court milled about with their drinks and their careful social performances, that Sovea made her next move. She called it a gesture of hospitality. Her generals would later call it a mistake. Her head of protocol, a meticulous woman named Ada Voss, would call it a provocation, dressed in a formal coat, which was, in her professional opinion, the most dangerous kind. Sovea approached Mara directly. She brought 2 of her generals with her, Halvek and Orvina, positioned slightly behind her and to each side. It was a power arrangement. Sovea had been arranging people around herself in positions of power since she was old enough to understand that positions meant things. "Commander," she said, with a smile that had the exact warmth of decorative stonework, "I would like to invite you to the military inspection parade tomorrow morning. It is a formal event, a review of our current active forces. You will see the full complement of the Northern Fleet Honor Battalion, Ground Assault Division, and Orbital Strike Wing." She paused, and then she added, with the particular quality of kindness that is really the opposite of kindness. I thought it might be educational. For you." Obi translated this. Mara looked at the princess. "I would be honored," she said. 2 words, translated. Clean and simple. Sauveya smiled more genuinely this time. An invitation accepted was an audience guaranteed, and an audience meant another opportunity to demonstrate the gap between Velithari military magnificence and whatever it was the humans had apparently sent. Halvek, standing slightly behind the princess's left shoulder, was watching the human's face. He was not watching it to be entertained. He was watching it because he was a general, and watching faces was part of his profession, and something about this face was making a very quiet, very old instinct in the back of his neck stand at attention. The human had not reacted to the museum piece comment. She had not reacted to the educational comment. She had not reacted to anything. Halvek had been in negotiations before. He had been in confrontations before. He had met warriors from 12 different species. Every single one of them, when mocked, did something. Even the ones who were disciplined enough not to show offense visibly did something small. A breath, a shift of weight, a blink. This woman had done nothing. Absolutely nothing. From the moment she stepped off that shuttle to this moment, her face had produced exactly one expression, which was the quiet, attentive, neutral expression of someone who was listening and thinking and giving nothing away at all. He found that significantly more unsettling than anything else about her. He kept this thought to himself, because the princess was still smiling, and the evening was still young, and he was not yet sure whether his instinct was correct or whether he was simply tired. He would later confirm that he was not simply tired. Before the delegation retired for the evening, Obi Crane found himself briefly alongside the princess's protocol aide, a young Velithari man named Sural, who was managing the scheduling of the following day's events. "Just a note," Obi said, in the mild conversational tone of someone saying nothing important. "The commander has attended 47 formal military reviews, across 9 species, including 2 that no longer have functioning governments." Sural looked at him. "Is that relevant?" Obi shrugged pleasantly. "Probably not." He smiled. "Have a good evening." The note was not passed to the princess. The inspection parade was, by every Velithari standard, magnificent. The Northern Fleet Honor Battalion moved in perfect formation down the central review lane. 300 soldiers in mirror-polished ceremonial armor. Every step synchronized, every movement exact. Behind them came the Ground Assault Division's forward companies, in full combat configuration, their equipment gleaming, their vehicles moving in flawless columns. And above them, in a low pass that rattled the windows of the reviewing stands, came 6 strike-wing interceptors in tight formation, their engines leaving clean white trails across the grey Ovith sky. The court applauded. The nobles cheered. The princess stood on the reviewing platform with her arms wide, receiving the spectacle like a gift she had arranged for herself. Mara Austin stood on the platform beside her, in the same armor she had arrived in, watching the parade. She watched it the way experienced people watch things, not with wonder, not with assessment, just watching, taking everything in. Her face doing what it always did, which was give away nothing. General Halvek stood on Sauveya's other side. He spent about 30% of his attention on the parade and 70% of his attention on the human, which was not the ratio he had planned when the morning started. Midway through the ground division pass, when the column of heavy assault vehicles was rolling past the platform and the noise was at its peak, Halvek made a decision. He was a general. He had commanded men in battle. He had looked at things that frightened him, and he had made decisions anyway. That was the job. He walked over to Mara Osten. She turned her head slightly to acknowledge his approach, but she did not move her body toward him. Halvek lifted his ceremonial staff, which was the traditional Velithari reviewing instrument, a long rod of dark metal used formally to inspect troops and equipment. He tapped Mara's armor. Not aggressively, precisely. The way you tap something when you want to understand what it is made of. The tap landed on the chest plate, right below the scorch marks. The sound it produced was not a clang. It was not a hollow ring. It was a low, deep, resonant hum, the kind of sound a very large, very dense material makes when you strike it, the kind of sound that travels not through the air around you, but through the floor beneath your feet. Halvek stepped back. Not far. One step. A controlled step. But back. Mara looked at him. She said nothing. The princess, 3 meters away, laughed. "Halvek, do not tell me the armor impressed you." Halvek looked at the armor, at the scorch marks, at the dents, at the worn joints and the darkened boots and the 40-something scratches. "No," he said, in the tone of a man who was lying and knew it. "Of course not." 2 meters to his left, General Orvina had watched the whole exchange. She looked at Admiral Teska. Teska looked back at her. Neither of them said anything, but they were both thinking the same thing. The state dinner that evening was held in the Grand Reception Hall, which had a ceiling painted with the entire history of the Velithari Empire in 17 panels, and could seat 300 guests for a formal meal without anyone feeling crowded. Tonight, it seated 40. The intimate format, Adavos had explained to the delegation, was a mark of particular honor. Sovea had approved this framing. What she had not mentioned was that 40 seats meant every word said at the main table would be heard by most of the room. Sovea sat at the head of the table. Mara sat 4 seats to her left, which was the position for military guests of notable rank. Obi sat 2 seats further along, in the translator's position. The 3 generals were distributed around the table. The dinner began with the traditional Velithari opening exchange, in which the host asks the most prominent guest a formal question, and the guest answers it for the room. It was ceremonial. It was supposed to be complimentary. It was a format Sovea had been using since she was 12 years old to make guests perform for her court. She turned to Mara. "Commander Osten," she said, pleasantly, with the whole room's attention. "Tell us, where did you earn your rank?" Obi translated. Mara looked at the princess. 14 engagements, she said. 3 ground campaigns. 2 deep space interdictions. 9 orbital actions. Obi translated. The room waited for more. There was no more. Sovea smiled. "And which of those," she said, "do you consider most significant?" "Vorach," Mara said. The word needed no translation. It was a place name. The generals all heard it. Halvek set his fork down, very carefully, without making a sound. Sovea, who had not heard of Vorach and had no reason to understand why Halvek was setting his fork down, continued pleasantly. "And do humans," she said, in a bright, theatrical tone that the whole table could hear, "still fight with their hands? I ask because I notice the armor appears to have been in close contact with several things." There was light, polite laughter from the courtiers. The 3 generals did not laugh. Obi translated. His expression was perfectly neutral. He was a professional. Mara looked at the princess for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." 1 word, translated. Sovea waited for elaboration. There was none. "Yes," she said. "We fight with our hands when the situation requires it," Mara said, "and with everything else when the situation requires that. We prefer to have options." The room was a little quieter now. "And what?" Sovea said, leaning forward slightly, still smiling, still performing, "is the most difficult thing you have ever fought?" Mara looked at her with those deep-water eyes. "Something that thought the same thing about us, that you're thinking right now," she said. Obi translated this in exactly the same flat, neutral tone he had used for every other sentence of the evening. The table was completely quiet. Sylvia laughed, clearly and confidently. "Well said," she offered, as a recovery. A warrior's answer. Around the table, not one of her 3 generals was smiling. The war room briefing the following morning had been requested by the generals, not by the princess. This was notable because it had never happened before. Sylvia attended because Ada Voss strongly recommended it, using the specific phrase, "I would be concerned if you did not," which in Voss's precise professional language was very nearly a shout. The war room was underground, under the palace's northern wing. It had a circular table with a central holographic display, seating for 12, and walls lined with tactical maps and fleet disposition boards. It smelled like recycled air and old decisions. Mara sat at one side of the circular table. Obi sat beside her. Across from them, Halvek, Orvina, and Teska sat together. Sylvia sat at the head position, as she always did in every room she entered. The human delegation has offered to share a tactical summary of their most recent major engagement, Halvek said, in the tone of a man reading a document he has already read several times. "Commander Austin, the floor is yours." Mara stood. She put a small data unit on the table. The central holographic display activated. She did not begin with context. She did not begin with background. She did not begin with anything that military briefers traditionally begin with to ease an audience into bad news. She began with a map. The map showed a planet, medium-sized, rocky, 2 small moons, designated formally as Vorak 4, in the outer zone of a dim star. Around it, she placed unit markers, hers in blue, the enemy in red. "Vorak 4, she said, 14 months ago. We were holding a supply corridor against a Varak advance. The Varak averaged 2.8 meters in height and 400 kilograms in combat configuration. They field units in groups of 12. She paused. We were holding with units of 6. Obi translated. Nobody looked at him while he did. They were all looking at the map. The initial engagement lasted 3 hours, Mara continued. We lost 11 personnel. The Varak lost 44. We held the corridor. She moved the timeline forward on the display. The second engagement came 8 hours later. We had not been resupplied. We held with 4 personnel on that line. We lost 2. They lost 19. She advanced the timeline again. Third engagement, 4 hours after that. We had 2 personnel on the corridor line. We held it for 6 hours until the support wing arrived. She turned off the display. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system was the loudest sound in it. The Varak retreated from the Vorak system entirely, she said. They have not re-engaged in that sector. She sat down. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Halvek looked at the blank display where the map had been. 2 personnel, holding a corridor against Varak advance units for 6 hours. The Varak, he knew. Every military force in this quadrant knew the Varak. The Varak had pushed 3 different species out of contested space in the last 20 years. The Varak did not retreat from anything. Except, apparently, they had retreated from 2 humans. General Orvina said quietly, What were their casualties on the third engagement? Mara looked at her. 31. Orvina did not visibly react, but her right hand, resting on the table, closed into a very slow, very tight fist. Admiral Teska spoke for the first time in the briefing. Her voice was flat and precise, and entirely controlled. "Commander, were these exceptional personnel? Specialists? Elite units?" "No," Mara said. "Standard assignment. Logistics, support, secondary duty." Both of them had been in service for less than 4 years. Teska absorbed this in silence. Halvek's aide, a young officer named Pell, who sat behind the generals and took notes, and was not expected to say or do anything during briefings, stood up very quietly and left the room. He was gone for the rest of the session. Nobody mentioned it. Sovea was looking at the blank display with an expression that was, for the first time since the delegation had arrived, not performing anything at all. She was looking at it with the expression of someone doing private, rapid recalculation in a way that they do not want anyone to see. But Obi Crane saw it. He saw most things, in most rooms. It was the skill that had kept him employed for 11 years. He said nothing. He wrote nothing down. He simply noted it, filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that mattered, and waited. The side conversation happened that afternoon, in the east corridor of the palace's residential wing, where the tall windows looked out over the Oveth River, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look like it was in a painting. Devra Yun was the captain of the princess's personal guard. She was not a ceremonial appointment. She had earned that position through 12 years of service and 2 engagements that she did not talk about at formal dinners. She was professional in the specific way that people who have seen real things are professional, which is quietly, constantly, and without any need for performance. She found Obi Crane standing at one of the windows, looking at the river, holding a cup of something warm. "Translator," she said. "Captain," he said. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the river. "The armor," Devra said. She did not ask a question. She said it the way you say something when you have been turning it over in your mind, and you want to hear if it sounds different out loud. Obi looked at the river. "What about it?" "It is not old," Devra said. "I have seen old armor. Old armor has a particular quality. It is worn in random patterns, random scratches, random aging." She paused. "The commander's armor is not randomly scratched," she said. "It is specifically marked. The damage pattern is too deliberate." Obi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a good eye." "What is it?" Devra asked. Obi turned the cup in his hands. "It's a record," he said simply. "Every scratch is logged. Every scorch mark, every dent, every point of damage. There is a corresponding entry in the armor's data archive. A date, a location, a name." Devra looked at him. "A name?" "The name of the individual whose action caused that mark," Obi said. "In 12 cases, the family of that individual formally requested that the mark not be repaired, as a form of acknowledgement." Devra was very still. "Acknowledgement of what?" she said. "That their person fought well," Obi said. He looked back at the river. "They still lost, but they fought well, and Mara does not clean the armor, because she was asked by those families not to. It would erase the record of what their people did." The silence in the corridor was different now. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just very full. "The families," Devra said slowly. "These are the families of enemies." "Yes," Obi said. "She carries the record of the enemies she defeated, because their families asked her to." "Yes." Devra Yun was quiet for a long time. She looked at the armor through her memory, the scratched chest plate, and the scorch marks, and the worn joints. She thought about the tap of Halvek's ceremonial staff, and the low hum it produced, like something very large and very dense, speaking in a language below the range of normal hearing. "How many names," she said, are in that archive? Obi looked at her. His expression was the same pleasant, mild expression he always wore. "I would not recommend asking her that," he said. From the far end of the corridor, there was the sound of footsteps. A palace steward appeared, turned, and walked the other direction without approaching them. Devra looked at the window, at the river, at the light that was making everything look like it was in a painting. She thought about the word museum piece, which the princess had said on the landing platform yesterday morning, and she thought about what a museum actually was, which was a place that kept records of things that had happened, things that were real, things that, unlike the gleaming ceremonial armor of the honor guard, had actually been places and done things and carried the weight of those places and things in every mark on their surfaces. She did not say anything else for a while. Neither did Obi. They stood at the window and watched the river move. The memo arrived at Soveya's desk at the 11th hour of the evening, when the palace was quieter and the day's performance was technically over, and she was sitting in her private study, in a plain robe without the working crown, reading diplomatic correspondence and trying not to think about a blank holographic display showing a planet called Vorak 4. It was a formal internal memo. Joint submission. 3 signatures at the bottom. Halvek, Orvina, Teska. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. Then she read it a third time, the way you read something when you are hoping that one of the words will change. The memo was 11 sentences long. The first 10 provided formal military and strategic context for the recommendation it contained. The language was careful, professional, correct in every structural requirement of Velithari military correspondence. The 11th sentence was the recommendation. 1 line. It read, "We do not want to be on the other side." No elaboration, no qualification, no diplomatic cushioning, just that. Soveya set the memo down on her desk. She looked at the wall for a moment. She picked the memo up and read the 11th sentence again. She set it down again. She thought about Halvek stepping back from the armor. 1 step. 1 careful, controlled step. From a man who had not stepped back from anything in 30 years of military service. And she had laughed and said, "Do not tell me the armor impressed you." And he had said, "No, of course not." And she had believed him. Because she had wanted to believe him. Because it was easier. And because believing something that complicates your performance is always harder than not believing it. She thought about Orvina's fist, closed on the table during the briefing. She thought about Teska speaking in that flat, controlled voice, asking whether the personnel were specialists, already knowing at some level what the answer was going to be before she asked. She thought about Mara Austin saying, "Something that thought the same thing about us that you're thinking right now." She sat in her chair in her plain robe in the quiet of her private study, and she did not sleep. Not for a long time. The final formal audience was scheduled for the following morning, in the small reception room, which was a name that was misleading because the room was neither small nor was it designed purely for reception. It was where real things got decided, away from the painted ceilings and the assembled courtiers, and the performances that everyone else needed to witness. Soveya had sent word through Ada Voss the previous evening that the meeting would be one-on-one. No generals, no aides, no Obi Crane in the translator's chair, because Soveya spoke functional galactic standard, and Mara Austin had demonstrated the capacity to use it, and some conversations did not benefit from a third person in the room. Mara arrived on time. She was in the armor, which Soveya had expected, and which still startled her when she saw it, even knowing everything she now knew, because it was just so completely and entirely at odds with everything in the room around it. all the silver and violet and polish and performance. They sat across from each other at the small table in the center of the room. No ceremony, no positioning of additional people in power arrangements. Just the table and 2 chairs and the gray morning light coming through the windows. Sauveilla had prepared something to say. She had worked on it, which was unusual for her, because she was usually good at speaking without preparation. But this required preparation, because she was attempting, for the first time in a diplomatic context, to say something that was real, and real things required more care than performances did. She opened her mouth. Mara spoke first. "Princess," she said, in plain galactic standard, without any formal framing, "you do not need to apologize." Sauveilla stopped. "I understand what you were doing," Mara said. "I understand why. I am not offended by it." Sauveilla looked at her. You were going to apologize in a way that preserved your position," Mara said. Not unkindly, not with any edge in her voice at all. Just plainly, just simply. The same way she said everything else, with the quiet directness of someone who had long ago stopped having time for things that weren't true. It would have been well constructed. I would have accepted it. The alliance would have been signed, and we both would have left this room feeling like the exchange was satisfactory. She paused. "But you would have learned the wrong lesson," she said. Sauveilla sat very still. "What is the right lesson?" she said. "That the things that look impressive," Mara said, "are not the same as the things that are dangerous, and that the gap between those 2 categories is where most disasters begin." She was not looking at the armor when she said it. She was looking at Sauveilla. "Your generals understand this already," she said. "That is why they sent you that memo. They are trying to tell you that they see the gap, and they do not want to be in it." Sauveilla said nothing. "You have a magnificent military," Mara said, and she said it without any flattery in it, the way you describe a fact. "The parade was genuinely excellent. Your honor battalion has better synchronization than anything I have seen from 4 other species. Your interceptors are fast. Your equipment is well maintained." "But," Sauveilla said. "There is no but in what I am saying," Mara said. "Those are real strengths. What I am saying is separate from those strengths." She looked at the table for a moment, then at the window. "You laughed at the armor," she said, "because it looked like it had been in too many fights. But the only reason anything looks like that is because it has survived the things that cause those marks. Something that looks perfect and unscratched and gleaming has either never been in contact with anything serious, or it gets repaired so quickly that the record disappears." She looked back at Sauveilla. "We do not repair it quickly," she said. "We keep the record, because the record is what tells you what you actually are versus what you look like." The room was quiet for a long time. Sauveilla looked at the armor, at the scorch marks, at the 2 long dark lines, one horizontal, one diagonal, crossing each other. She thought about Devra Yun telling her that morning what Obi had said in the corridor, about the families who asked that the marks be kept, about the names in the archive, about what it meant to carry the record of the people who had tried their best against you and still lost, not as a trophy, but as a debt you were choosing to acknowledge. "Nobody," she said slowly, "has ever told me something like that directly." "I know," Mara said. "Your people do not do that. It would read as disrespect in your culture. I understand that." She paused. "But we are different, and you ask to understand us, so I am telling you directly. That is how we do it." Sauveilla was quiet. "The alliance," she said after a moment. "The alliance is good for both our peoples," Mara said. That has not changed. Your generals are right. Being on the other side would be costly for you. And we do better with strong partners than without them. That is a very practical position, Sovea said. Yes, Mara said. We are practical people. The alliance was signed an hour later, in the formal ceremony room, with the correct number of witnesses and the correct number of official stamps and the correct amount of documentation for the historical record. Ada Voss supervised every element of it with the focused energy of someone who had been holding her breath for 3 days. The court celebrated. There was music and food, and the particular kind of satisfied noise that fills a room when official things go officially well. Princess Sovea stood in the middle of it, wearing the working crown, receiving the congratulations of her court with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times. She was present. She was correct. She performed every element of the occasion without error. But in the part of her mind that was not performing, the part that had sat awake in the quiet study, reading an 11-sentence memo for the 3rd time, she was thinking about a sentence she had said on a landing platform 3 days ago. I was told humans sent warriors. I did not expect them to send a museum piece. And about Mara Austen descending a shuttle ramp in dented, scratched, scorch-marked armor, saying nothing at all, looking at her with those deep-water eyes. And about the difference between a museum, which was a place that preserved the record of things that had happened, and a trophy case, which was a place where you put things that made you look good. And about the fact that she had spent her entire life building a trophy case and had not, until 3 days ago, understood that the other option existed. The music played. The court talked and laughed and ate. Sovea smiled at everyone who approached her, said the right things, received the right responses, performed the occasion correctly and completely. But later, much later, when the hall was emptying and the servants were beginning the quiet work of restoration that follows every celebration, she stood alone for a moment near the tall windows at the south end of the room. She looked at the landing platform on the roof of the building across the courtyard. The human shuttle was gone. It had departed 2 hours ago. Matte gray against the gray Aveth sky, slipping up through the clouds without ceremony, without drama, without any announcement that anything significant was ending. It was the last piece of performance she expected from them. It was exactly what she got. Sovea stood at the window for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back into the room. And she was a princess again, and she did her job. But something in the way she held her chin was different. Not quite as high, not quite as certain of what it meant. Just a fraction. Just enough that Ada Voss, standing near the door and watching with the professional attention of someone who had spent 30 years reading the people in this room,